December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The air is heavy with the sweet scent of tropical flowers and the distant hum of engines from Ford Island. Sailors aboard the USS West Virginia and USS California are finishing breakfast, the calm of a Sunday morning wrapping the harbor in false peace. Then, the sirens. At 7:55 a.m., the first Japanese torpedo bombers sweep low over the water, sunlight flashing off their wings. The sound of engines becomes a roar. Within seconds, the sky turns black with smoke and tracer fire. Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. The radio call echoes across the base. Torpedoes slice into the hull of the West Virginia, exploding below the waterline. Men are thrown from their bunks, scrambling through smoke-filled corridors. On the deck, Ensign Charles Parker shouts for damage control teams. But within minutes, the ship lists sharply to port, flames licking at the oil-slicked surface of the harbor. Nearby, the USS Arizona erupts in a blinding flash, a magazine explosion so violent it lifts the entire battleship from the water. The shock wave hammers across the bay. In just under 2 hours, 8 battleships lie burning or sunk, 188 aircraft destroyed, and more than 2,400 Americans dead. The Pacific Fleet, the pride of the United States Navy, seems broken. Thousands of miles away in Tokyo, the mood is triumphant. In radio reports and war rooms, Japanese officers exchange quiet nods of satisfaction. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the attack, bows his head slightly. The strike has exceeded all expectations, but even he feels a chill. Quietly, to his staff, he murmurs the words that will haunt history. I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. At that moment, he has no idea how right he is, because while the smoke still rises from Pearl Harbor, America's shipbuilders, engineers, and divers are already beginning a race against time, a race that will leave Japan stunned just 6 months later. December 8th, 1941, Pearl Harbor Naval Base. The air still reeks of smoke and oil. Battleships lie half submerged, their superstructures twisted like skeletons in the sun. Navy divers, their faces blackened with grease and soot, lower themselves into the dark waters around Battleship Row. Every dive is dangerous. Jagged steel, leaking fuel, and the bodies of fallen crewmen trapped below decks. Lieutenant Commander Edward Raymer, one of the first Navy salvage divers to arrive, later wrote, "Visibility was zero. The water was thick with oil, pitch black. You could only feel your way along the hull and pray the air hoses didn't snag." The USS West Virginia rests upright but deeply sunk, its hull torn open by 7 torpedoes. The California has settled into the mud. Both are thought to be total losses, but Admiral Chester Nimitz, newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, refuses to accept that verdict. Standing on the dock, gazing over the destruction, he says quietly to his staff, "The Japanese did us a great favor. They destroyed everything except our determination." He issues an audacious order: salvage everything that can float. Within days, the Navy launches the greatest ship recovery operation in history. Thousands of engineers, welders, and Seabees, U.S. Navy construction battalions, pour into Pearl Harbor. Civilian shipwrights arrive from the mainland. Salvage cranes and pumps operate day and night, working under floodlights that cut through the lingering smoke. Crews patch holes with massive steel plates, seal compartments, and pump thousands of gallons of water and oil out of the shattered hulls. Divers use underwater torches to slice through twisted steel, their work guided only by touch. At the same time, naval engineers begin repairing dry docks and workshops that were themselves bombed. Every hammer blow echoes like defiance. The work is grueling, dangerous, and constant. Men sleep in shifts. Others labor in the heat and stench of oil-soaked decks. But the resolve is absolute. This is no longer about ships. It's about redemption. Across the Pacific, Japan's intelligence reports continue to assume the American fleet will be out of action for at least 2 years. Tokyo believes it has time to expand its empire across the Pacific, to fortify island chains before the United States can respond. But in the shipyards of Pearl Harbor, something extraordinary is happening. January 1942, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Rain falls softly over the harbor, washing soot from the wrecks. Beneath the cranes and scaffolding, the sound of clanging steel replaces the echo of explosions that once tore through this place. The USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, has already been beached to prevent sinking. She's now in dry dock, stripped to her ribs, being refitted and rearmed. Engineers shake their heads at the pace of work. Only weeks after being bombed, her turrets are being tested again. Farther down the line, the USS West Virginia is being painstakingly raised. Pumps groan as water is forced from her flooded compartments. Divers patch holes by feel, bolting heavy steel plates into place, sometimes while waist-deep in oil and silt. When the last compartment is sealed, compressed air is pumped in. Slowly, the ship begins to rise. The men cheer when her deck breaks the surface again. One diver, surfacing in triumph, simply says, "She wants to live." By March, the California is also afloat, her hull newly sealed. Inside, engineers clear the wreckage and begin rewiring her systems from scratch. It's a process that would normally take years. But this time, it's being done in months. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships coordinates an unprecedented logistical operation. Cargo vessels arrive from San Francisco packed with replacement turrets, electrical cables, and boiler parts. Teams of women in mainland factories, the riveters, work triple shifts to supply every component needed. The salvage crews become a family. They share meals beside the docks, their faces lined with exhaustion and streaked with oil. Some of them had lost brothers and friends in the attack. Now every rivet they drive feels like an act of revenge. By April 1942, 4 of the 8 battleships sunk or damaged at Pearl Harbor have either returned to service or are under full reconstruction. The pace astonishes observers. Newspapers back home call it the miracle of Battleship Row. And still, Admiral Nimitz pushes harder. "We are not rebuilding ships," he tells his men. "We are rebuilding the spirit of the fleet." Meanwhile, far across the Pacific, the Japanese Navy celebrates its victories in the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. Tokyo believes America's naval power is shattered. But soon the empire will discover how wrong it is, because even as the hammers ring in Pearl Harbor, new carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, are preparing for battle. And by June, the Pacific will erupt once more. May 1942, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The harbor looks different now. The air no longer carries the acrid tang of burning oil, but the rhythmic hum of machinery, cranes swinging overhead, welders showering sparks against newly forged steel. The stars and stripes fly proudly from half-restored masts that just months earlier lay buried beneath the water. The USS Pennsylvania, once trapped in dry dock during the attack, is already repaired and steaming out for gunnery trials. The Maryland and Tennessee, damaged but never sunk, have been refitted with new anti-aircraft batteries and radar systems. The Nevada, raised and overhauled, prepares to rejoin the Pacific Fleet. But it's the USS West Virginia that draws the most attention. Divers who had once pulled the bodies of her crew from the lower decks now stand shoulder to shoulder on the pier, watching as her engines turn for the first time since the attack. Black smoke curls from her funnels, not from destruction, but from rebirth. In a nearby office, Admiral Nimitz studies a classified report. Intelligence intercepts, part of the newly decrypted Japanese communication system, known as JN-25, have revealed something extraordinary. Japan is preparing to strike again, this time at a small atoll in the middle of the Pacific, Midway. The Admiral circles the date, June 4th, 1942. The fleet must be ready. Every available ship is rushed into final repairs. Mechanics work through the night. On the mainland, Yorktown, damaged in the Coral Sea, undergoes a near impossible repair in just 72 hours, a feat so fast that Japanese command later refuses to believe it actually happened. At Pearl Harbor, morale soars. The men who once stood amid wreckage now work with a grim, burning confidence. They know the Japanese think them broken. They intend to prove otherwise. By late May, the harbor roars to life once more. Battleships, cruisers, and carriers steam out past the buoys of Oahu, their guns manned, their decks alive with fresh crews. The same waters that had been a graveyard only 6 months earlier now churn white with the wake of a resurrected armada. Sailors line the rails, staring at the horizon. One young gunner from the California writes in his journal, "We were supposed to be ghosts. Now we're coming back to haunt them." June 4th, 1942, Midway Atoll, Central Pacific. The ocean is calm, deceptively so. In the early dawn light, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, sail eastward, unaware that the American fleet is waiting. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding from Pearl Harbor, has already read their intentions. Thanks to U.S. codebreakers, he knows the date, the target, and even the attack plan. At 4:30 a.m., Japanese bombers rise into the sky. Their target, the tiny U.S. outpost at Midway. But far beyond their sight, 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the newly repaired Yorktown, maneuver into striking position. From Yorktown's deck, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey leads his dive bombers into formation. Below him, the ocean gleams like glass. Over the radio comes the simple, chilling order: pilots, man your planes. The engines roar to life. Propellers blur. As the carrier decks tilt into the wind, one after another, the bombers leap skyward. At 10:20 a.m., the first American dive bombers find the Japanese fleet. They arrive almost by miracle, guided by instinct and luck after missing their initial rendezvous. When they finally break through the clouds, they spot the enemy below, decks crowded with refueling planes, bombs scattered, fuel lines snaking across the wood. God, there they are. McCluskey dives. The world explodes in flame. Within minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu are engulfed in towering infernos. Pilots and deck crews run in panic as the ocean boils with debris. By noon, 3 of Japan's elite carriers are finished. Hours later, the Hiryu launches a desperate counterattack, striking the Yorktown twice. Smoke pours from her decks. Yet somehow, the battered carrier stays afloat long enough for her planes to find Hiryu and deliver a final, fatal blow. When the sun sets on June 4th, 4 of Japan's 6 frontline carriers lie burning on the sea. For the first time in the war, the Imperial Navy has been defeated decisively. Back in Tokyo, disbelief ripples through the high command. How could the Americans have recovered so quickly? How could they rebuild a fleet in 6 months and use it to crush the pride of Japan's navy. Yamamoto receives the news in silence. He removes his cap, stares out the window at the gray sea beyond, and mutters a single phrase: "The war has turned." June 6, 1942, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The radio crackles through the humid air. The message spreads from ship to ship, pier to pier. Enemy carriers sunk. Midway secure. Victory confirmed. Sailors erupt in cheers. For the men who rebuilt the ships, who worked knee-deep in oil and sweat for 6 relentless months, it feels deeply personal. The ghosts of December 7th have finally been avenged. At the docks, Admiral Nimitz addresses his exhausted crews. "They hit us when we were down, but they forgot Americans get back up." Across the Pacific, newspapers print headlines that echo around the world. Pearl Harbor avenged. Japanese carriers destroyed. The miracle is complete. The same shipyards that once smoldered in ruin have rebuilt a fleet that changed the course of history. The West Virginia, California, Nevada, and Yorktown became symbols not just of steel and machinery, but of endurance, unity, and will. Japan had believed the attack on Pearl Harbor would cripple America for years. Instead, it lit a fire that forged one of the greatest industrial and military mobilizations the world had ever seen. From the ashes of December rose the might of June, and with it, the turning of the Pacific War. The ocean is quiet again now. The waves roll gently over the reefs of Oahu, whispering against the hulls of ships reborn. And somewhere out there, on the endless horizon, the sleeping giant moves, awake and unstoppable.